My name is Renata Rostkowska. I'm a director of CCA Temporary Gallery in Cologne, and I'm welcoming you today from Schüppingen, from Stiftung Künstlerdorf Schüppingen, who is the main organizer of the summer seminar towards permacultural institutions, exercises in collective thinking. We have been here with a group of international participants for almost 1 week, having very intense discussions concerning how we want to work differently, and in what kind of art institutions we want to work, and how we would like to respond with our work to to climate change, to this crisis that is developing now. And it has been, I think, very, very, very fruitful and good week for our group. And this is the last of the Zoom lectures that we are offering also to a wider audience, and we also record them, and we want to publish all of them online. And I'm super happy to introduce our two guests to everyone, Maja and Reuben Fowkes. They are curators, critics, and art historians. They are based in London, and they specialize in East European art history and this whole conglomerate of topics related to contemporary art and ecology. They are running a Translocal Institute for Contemporary Art since many years, and curated exhibitions and published books. And I have there, I think that's your most recent book, Art and Climate Change, in this famous series World of Art that I'm sure everybody knows. And I'm super happy that they agreed to be here with us, because I'm following their work since many years, and I think it's a very kind of a very coherent and consequent body of work where things accumulate, and there's like a certain quality that comes with, I think, dealing with concrete topics for a longer period of time. So I think today they will present a lecture, self-management of plants. After the lecture, we will have a Q&A, and all our Zoom participants I encourage to ask questions via chat, and you can also write comments, and we will have a little discussion later. So Maja and Reuben, please, thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for the introduction, for the kind introduction, Annetta, and it's really great to be here virtually, to see you all in the garden outside. It's a perfect setting, I think, for these kinds of discussions. And hi everyone. And just thinking about climate change, it's quite extraordinary that we're sitting here in London looking out at the blue sky as well. And over the next 3 days, there's going to be we're expecting like a very extreme weather event of heating, and climate change is extremely tangible around here in the UK at the moment. So it really underlines how important it is to discuss these issues and think about the implications of climate change for how we work and also for institutions. But we're going to be talking today about the self-management of plants.
So, climate change is radically transforming our relationship with plants. The threat to biodiversity posed by anthropogenic disruption of Earth systems is prompting a renewed alertness towards plants, living beings that Western epistemology has regularly dismissed as unmoving, inactive, unthinking, unfeeling, and inanimate. A reinvigorated scientific research into plants, which is increasingly coalescing with indigenous and traditional knowledges, is dispelling the willful ignorance towards the multi-dimensionality of vegetal life. Climate change is also rendering the intensive model of agriculture based on chemical inputs and fossil fuel energy unviable. Unsettling the principles of capitalist cultivation based on exploitative and extractive approach, climate disruption necessitates a return to biodiverse and smaller scale methods of farming that are more resilient and also entail a different attitude to plants based on care, understanding, and cooperation.
Today, we will look into artistic practices that are concerned with restoring attentiveness to the resilience, unruliness, and reparative power of plants. Those practices that reveal the vitality and ingenuity of botanical life forms, and at the same time, practices which articulate a plant-centric critique of social and economic systems. In particular, we will consider those plants which one governmental website identifies as, quote, undesirable, persistent, damaging, and interfering with the growth of other crop plants, thus affecting human activities, agriculture, natural processes, and the economy of the country. In other words, we're going to talk about so-called weeds and invasive species, posing the question of how the vilification of plants also holds up a mirror to social and political injustices. On the other hand, we want to think about to what extent could parallels be drawn between the ruderal vitality of such species and grassroots organisational forms based on democratic and egalitarian principles that can be viewed through the prism of self-management, as it was theorised and practised in socialist Yugoslavia, and which also found a fruitful ground in the revolutionary upheavals of 1968. We also want to point to ways in which embracing the agency of pioneering plants and letting go of the taxonomic superiority complex of hierarchical kingdoms might indicate a path for the reimagining of climate-conscious art institutions.
The modern history of plant science has been strongly marked by political and economic interests ever since botany was mobilized in the quest for green gold during the long 18th century or at the height of colonial expansion and conquest of the so-called New World. In her Plants and Empire, science historian Londa Schibinger described how botany, defined as expertise in bioprospecting, plant identification, transport, and acclimatization, worked hand in hand with European colonial expansion to the extent that even the father of botanical taxonomy, Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, taught that the purpose of natural history was to render service to the state. In other words, we see how, from the outset, plant science was closely entwined with the interest of empire and the state. Encouraged by imperial powers to unlock the botanical secrets of indigenous knowledge and capitalize on their medicinal and agricultural potential, botanists of the New World also instigated active process of global species transportations.
The common perception of weeds as plants in the wrong place can be traced to the impact of the global movement of plants in the wake of colonial expansion, or more accurately, to the fears of contamination by alien outsiders that were projected onto plants in Western science and popular culture. For example, the authors of Nature Out of Place, Biological Invasions in the Global Age invoke such visceral anxieties with statements such as, quote, though the forests are still green and the lakes are still full of water, an unending stream of invasions is changing these and many other ecosystems from productive, tightly integrated webs of native species into loose assemblages of stressed native species and aggressive invaders to turn the earth into a planet of weeds. The modern era, with the conjuncture of colonial expansion and the rise of ethnic nationalism, saw from the 19th century a harshening and a hardening of these negative attitudes in traditional agricultural societies towards plants that grow where they're not wanted, seeing them as valueless, undesirable, and troublesome.
Further impetus, and to an extent a different approach to weeds within the botanical science, came in the 20th century from socialist states. Under Soviet socialism, for example, the Great Stalin Plan for the Transformation of Nature of 1948 gave state biologist Trofim Lysenko free rein to experiment with ideologically tinged theories such as floral collectivism, which saw trees planted in comradely clusters to protect against weeds that were stigmatized not so much as unwanted foreigners or aliens, but actually as class enemies.
Zheng Bo explored the correlation between plants and ideology in his work Socialism Good, which was created as a site-specific installation for the former Cass Sculpture Foundation in southern England. The Communist Party's slogan of Socialism Good was recreated as a floral arrangement in Chinese characters. Flowers had previously been used to deliver this propaganda message during the national celebrations of 1991 in Tiananmen Square, which was the site of the brutal repression of student-led democracy protests 2 years earlier. Along with issues around the instrumentalization of plants to propagate ideological slogans and suppress freedom of speech, his work also made reference to official Communist Party attitudes to the natural world, which since the 1950s had been guided by Mao Zedong's dictums, man must conquer nature and make the high mountain bow its head, make the river yield the way. As Judith Shapiro put it in Mao's War Against Nature, the conquest of nature and prosperity of humankind were believed to be at hand through the miracle of socialism.
Now, by deploying the floral sign in the wake of the domestic turmoil of 1989 and the near-global collapse of the communist system, the party sought to enlist vegetal beings to reassert the correct Chinese path to socialism. While in the original scenario, the propaganda plants were kept in line with a tightly controlled horticultural setting, in the artist version, the flower beds were left unattended and weeds were allowed to grow between the Chinese characters. This literally raised the prospect of grassroots resistance within a monolithic, monocultural, regimented, and hyper-controlled political system. By pointing to the individual and collective agency of plants, it also alluded to the possibility of another kind of socialism based not on top-down state control, but on the autonomous action and self-management by socialist citizens. On a phytological level, the work challenged discriminatory attitudes towards the so-called weeds and called for a more emphatic approach.
What is more, the grounds for this more empathic and welcoming approach to weeds can be found in more recent scientific thinking, which steps back from the narrow anthropocentrism of invasion biology. In his The Life of Weeds, John Cardina points out that it's human activity that has been primarily responsible for providing the conditions for the evolution of adaptive traits that made certain plants especially widespread, persistent, and troublesome. And this is foremost by enabling their global dispersal. Others have emphasized not human actions in determining the prospects of plants, but the role of vegetal agency in shaping the plant's own environment. The refusal of weeds in particular to, quote, play by our rules, as Richard Mabey observed in Weeds, The Story of Outlaw Plants, made them subversive and the very essence of wildness. It's these subversive qualities of weeds that come to the fore in Zheng Bo's Socialism Good. At the same time, the trait of disobedience to the rules and outlaw behavior of weeds may turn out to be their most valuable qualities when it comes to adapting to climate change. Such unruliness also corresponds to ideas of self-management.
The self-management of post-industrial flora as manifestation of resilience was at stake in Croatian artist Igor Eshkinja's work Do Plants Dream of the Future, which took as its subject the vegetation that thrives in the post-socialist ruins of the Croatian port city of Rijeka. The capacity of weeds to prosper in proximity to humans, opportunistically populating new landscapes such as decaying factory buildings, roofs, and other neglected urban infrastructures, was for the artist an indicator of their enormous vitality and force, resourcefulness and energy in occupying and transforming of space and life. Eshkinja uncovered the botanical and environmental history of the city, from the expulsion of nature with the beginning of industrial development and urbanization in the 19th century to the return of biodiversity to industrial sites abandoned since the 1990s through the flourishing of self-seeding plants. Referring to the 19th century vogue for wall coverings decorated with floral and exotic botanical motifs, he produced a series of wallpapers patterned with weed specimens now living in the industrial areas of the city. For cultural anthropologist Bettina Stötzer, the ruderal worlds that emerged spontaneously in inhospitable urban environments point to often unnoticed, cosmopolitan, yet precarious way of remaking the urban fabric. In that sense, by deliberating about a phytocentric futurity, do plants have a future? The artist raised the question whether ruderal plants, through their vigor, subversiveness, and adaptability, may stand as signposts for the empowerment of the cities in climate transition.
So when the factories whose ruins were explored by Eshkenya were in full production mode, they were operating within the Yugoslav third way socialist system that was marked by non-alignment on the international stage and workers' self-management at home. Historically, the policy of self-management arose in the context of the Tito-Stalin split of 1948 as a means of distinguishing Yugoslav socialism from what they called the Stalinist deviation and returning to the workers' councils of Lenin's time. It's been described, therefore, on the one hand, so self-management has been described, therefore, on the one hand, as a, quote, movement implemented from above, which was materialized in a dominant ideology and in the social development policy of a new state that promised to improve the material conditions for everyone. However, self-management can simultaneously be viewed as a phenomenon from below, quote, a successful and long-term practice of organizing workers in specific companies and social and cultural sectors. And this kind of self-organization extending even to the organization of strikes and actions that challenge the party hegemony. In practice, self-management in Yugoslav factories entailed workers' councils making decisions about how to spend the firm's income, as well as making decisions over housing, holidays, and wages. While experts still had the say over technical issues, and such localized forms of direct democracy in the workplace were exercised within the overarching and undemocratic framework of a one-party state, in contrast to today's conditions of generalized precarity under global capitalism, the factory director did not have the right to sack employees without the council's permission.
Although the original model of Yugoslav self-management related to the factory, in later phases it went on to spread to other institutions of social and cultural life. It also appealed to leftist intellectuals outside of the country who saw its potential to challenge the dominance of state structures. Self-management was one of the key insurrectionary streams of the revolutionary uprisings of 1968, when, as Yves Rémion put it in Orgasms of History, 3,000 Years of Spontaneous Insurrection, the notion of self-management as a flesh and blood political arrangement took hold in people's minds. A key proponent of the French version of self-management was Henri Lefebvre, who published a text on the theoretical problems of autogestion in 1966. Interestingly, he was also one of the first Western intellectuals invited to join Korčula Summer School in Croatia in 1964, giving him the opportunity to engage with the leading Yugoslav Marxist thinkers around Praxis Group, which was an experience that informed also his writings on self-management.
In his book, Alienation Effects, Performance and Self-Management in Yugoslavia, theatre scholar Branislav Jakovljević compares Yugoslav and French streams of thinking around self-management, and he quotes Lefebvre. This is a quote from Lefebvre. In essence, autogestion calls the state into question as a constraining force erected above society as a whole, capturing and demanding the rationality that is inherent to social relations. Once aimed at ground level, in a fissure this humble plant comes to threaten the huge state edifice. As is well known to members of state, autogestion tends to reorganize the state as a function of its development, which is to say that it tends to engender the state's withering away. So that's all a quote from Lefebvre.
What we find particularly telling here is Lefebvre's use of vegetal metaphors in his theorization of self-management. Vegetal imagery is present in the axiom of withering away of the state, with withering etymologically rooted in the drying up and shriveling of plants from lack of water, expressing the idea that self-management will cause the state to lose its function and disappear as the ultimate goal of the Marxist anticipation of the transition to communism. The transformative potential of self-management is vividly compared with the plant that grows in the crack in a building and ends up threatening the whole edifice. It is notably at the ground level, from the grassroots position of the plant, that self-management provides the tools to subvert the hierarchies maintained by force that seek to control and structure society and thought. What emerges here are the commonalities between the radical potential of self-management and the pervasive power of plants. And obviously, Lefebvre's metaphor refers not to cultivated varieties, but to ruderal plants or weeds.
The plants that grow, the plants that grow in the cracks of concrete and thrive in the fissures of urban wastelands and abandoned development sites were investigated by Danish artist Camilla Berner on the occasion of her exhibition Still Alive in Seoul, South Korea in 2016. In which she asked how sites are perceived by self-organizing nature itself. One photographic work in the show was prepared in Copenhagen and referenced the Korean flower arrangements known as hwa-hwan, traditionally made for celebrations such as weddings or birthdays with roses, lilies, or other colorful flowers. In the artist version, however, the assembly was meticulously put together with wildflowers, weeds and grasses collected from a post-industrial site intended for future gentrification. In Seoul, Berner researched the floral vegetation of similar locations, creating bouquets from these often overlooked, yet hardy and adaptable plants that also communicate the specific socioeconomic circumstances of the site from which they originated. One such spot was the last remaining building site in the affluent commercial city of Gangnam, for the ownership of which Samsung and Hyundai were competing at the very time. And therefore the artist could only reach towards the vegetation that was spreading under the fences of the building. For each bouquet, the artist used a matching vase by the Royal Copenhagen Porcelain Company, interrogating through the genre of still life painting the comparable position of wild plants in Danish and Korean culture. He also appended a detailed list of species used in the composition of each plant collection in a way to challenge their marginalized status in horticultural circles.
Reflecting on the extraordinary transformation of China's built environment in recent decades that has seen a ravaging spread of urbanization, Zheng Bo's intervention on the roof garden of a newly erected Xifang Art Museum in Nanjing entailed creating a refuge for weeds collected from the changing neighborhoods. By planting a weed plot for plants endangered by constantly advancing construction sites, the artist pointed to the encroachment of ultramodernity that disrupts people's connection with the other species, pointing out that, as the artist says, 100 years ago, you didn't need to go to a museum to reconnect with the weeds. This work inverts the story of plants flourishing in the cracks of urban structures by pointing to the reduction in biodiversity brought by the concreting over of land. The rapidity with which the conditions for vegetal life are being destroyed in the country's high-tech urban sprawl is suggested by the fact that China currently pours more concrete in 2 years than the United States did over the whole 20th century. The role of ruderal plants in the political imaginary is a recurrent concern in Bauer's practice, focusing on the issues of overlooked and marginalized, yet resilient and disobedient vegetal protagonists who constantly seek a path to self-management in the midst of a hyper-controlled urban order.
Engaging with wild plants within a 20-minute walk of her studio in rural Goa, Indian artist Aditya Kumar anticipated a future in which forgotten plants could be reintegrated into the lives of local communities blighted by monocultures. Her interactive installation, The Unwanted Ecology, consisted of a glass jar containing dried samples of 20 plants denigrated as weeds. Each of these was electronically matched with a sound frequency. As visitors approached the jar, altering the atmospheric humidity, the sound levels emitted from this technologically reincarnated organism, as the artist called it, also changed, reenacting the missed or invisible encounters between plants and people. Alongside this sensorial attempt to rekindle appreciation for neglected plant species, the installation also had a book with information about their nutritional and medicinal qualities, ethnobiological knowledge that risks being lost as local healers disappear. Kumar also emphasized the resilience of these vegetal survivalists in face of the high temperatures and drought conditions that are degrading the landscape as global warming intensifies.
Now, the resilience of wild plants was also the subject of Annalie Davis' collaborative project, Bush Tea Plots, from 2019. And we're sure, I don't know if Annalie is still there. Yes, that's nice. We know you are familiar with Annalie's work, but however, it's important also to consider it in this context. Now, this work is focused on the ecological damage caused by monocultural farming of sugar on Barbados and wild plants' capacity through phytoremediation to absorb toxins and restore harmony to environments scarred by the physical and psychological legacies of slavery. Reflecting on the resurgence of wild botanicals, she observed on walks through the abandoned sugarcane fields behind her studio, the artist used a glass planter to make visible the biological action of uncultivated vegetation in nourishing and restoring layers of soil made barren by monocultural production. Annalie also referred in the work to the hidden history of bush tea practices in which healers use West African medicinal knowledge to provide herbal cures and spiritual relief to their communities. These medicinal plants came mostly from the small plots given over to slaves to grow their own food, which became, in the words of Jamaican writer Sylvia Wynter, a source of cultural guerrilla resistance to the plantation systems. Perhaps these plots, which were outside of the economics or direct control of the plantation estate, could be seen as a form or a source of self-management of plants. The wild herbs represented for the artist an apothecary of resistance with the ability to counteract the devastating effects of the plantation system on the life of the island, while challenging at the same time resilience on imported pharmaceuticals during the post-plantation era.
Looking to the longer histories of the tension between hierarchical forms of control and the resistance of self-managed plants, French artist Suzanne Husky drew on her background in landscape gardening to realize Jardin à la Française Sauvage. The work entailed reinventing the 17th century French formal garden in the Chateau Park of Domaine de Chamarande as an experiment in botanical wilderness. Her floral labyrinth referenced in its layout the history of French horticulture in the age of Louis XIV, when, as Chandra Mukherjee asserted in Territorial Ambitions and the Gardens of Versailles, gardens were a microcosm to showcase the military and political power of the Sun King, Louis XIV, and also a model of material domination of nature, in which land was, quote, surveyed and measured and stamped as something under human control. However, in Husky's ecocentric version, plants were chosen not for their self-aggrandizing effect, but based on the needs of the soil, the cycle of life, and the relation of spaces with their environment, with the selection of wild grasses and perennial meadow flowers intended to provide a habitat and winter food resource for birds and insects. Challenging the political and aesthetic instrumentalization of vegetal life, the wildness of this French formal garden is also a premonition of a future in which only plants able to adapt to changing climate will survive.
The hostility directed towards weeds and suspicion towards their origins and right to belong takes an even more heightened and more ideologically problematic form in attitudes to newcomer plants condemned as invasive species. The divisive politics of populist governments that have come to power in Europe and across the world in the last decade is charged with the xenophobic sentiments of hostility towards foreign influence and heightened fear of migrants. The nationalist and anti-globalist agenda is also transposed onto zoological and botanical realms, where plants with different geographical histories are vilified and labeled as non-native or invasive and subject to public campaigns of eradication.
The myth of native purity has, however, been corroded by climate disruption, bringing in its wake the unstoppable resettlement of species across the planet. Ecological crisis has therefore sharpened the critique of invasion biology, a subdiscipline of biology with a guiding assumption that foreign species pose a vital threat to the native flora and fauna of local ecosystems, disclosing it as unwittingly echoing populist rhetoric and misconstruing scientific evidence. Intervening in the entangled domains of politics, science, and ecology, artists have challenged this demonization of weeds as well as of invasive species, uncovering complex histories of their redistribution and engendering collaborative scenarios in which the agency of non-native pioneers is released to restore and revivify devastated post-industrial environments.
The hostile attitude towards non-native species in the field of invasion biology was formed under the influence of polarized Cold War thinking and can be traced to the publication of Charles Eaton's founding Ecology of Invasions of Animal and Plants from 1958, in which a warmongering vocabulary and the fight against ideological foes was transformed and transferred onto botanical threats. The book opened with the warning that nowadays we live in a very explosive world, where it's not just nuclear bombs and wars that threaten us, but also ecological explosions. Within scientific circles, the belligerent outlook of invasion biology has since been discredited as very similar to anti-globalist movement, which laments the replacement of authentic local culture with synthetic and homogenized culture. The ecologist Mark Davis also took the lead in formulating a programmatic challenge to the xenophobic precepts of invasion biology in an article in Nature entitled "Don't Judge Species on Their Origins," demanding with 18 co-signatures to abandon of the native versus alien species dichotomy. They disputed the false claim that introduced species pose an apocalyptic threat to biodiversity, since the scientific data actually shows that the introduction of non-native species has almost always increased the number of species in the region. The aggressive and dissimulating agenda of invasion biology has been undermined by rapidly changing ecological circumstances that refute and reverse its prejudicial assumptions about redistributed species.
So a new wave of environmental thinking, which goes to the lengths of proposing the term guest species to denote those beneficial non-native species that are welcome into our ecosystem, has acknowledged the integral role of newcomer plants in the dynamic response of the natural world to intensifying ecological crisis. Advocates of the new wild see signs of natural resilience in the strength and colonizing abilities of alien species, who often become, in effect, the new natives, in novel ecosystems that combine both introduced and indigenous species. The emphasis that invasion biology placed on deliberate or accidental human assistance in introducing non-native species to new environments has also given way to a greater recognition of plant agency in migration. Ecologist Chris Thomas has correspondingly observed that in response to climate disruption, quote, around 2/3 of the species that researchers have studied in recent decades have shifted their distribution to become commoner in those places where the climate has, in quotes, improved for them, He goes on to predict that, in the long run, it is the species that keep moving and successfully exploit new environments that will survive and prosper and thus ensure the survival of their kin on planet Earth. In other words, species which are not constrained by hierarchical structures and have the ability through self-management to reorganize are the most able to adapt to the changing climate. Anthropogenic alterations to habitats and climate chaos therefore necessitate the pragmatic embrace of novel assemblages of human and non-human entities to accommodate new forms of coexistence.
In that sense, artists have investigated changing attitudes to newcomer plants by covering the ideological origins of scientific construct of botanical invasiveness and disclosing cases of the demonization of migrant species from the era of totalitarianisms to a discordant present of late liberalism and anti-globalist populism. Distinguishing between arbitrary projections onto resettled species and ecological evidence of environmental histories in which social and natural processes are intertwined, they challenge the vilification of plant migration in the political imaginary. They also raise the question of whether newfound empathy for incoming plants is based on anything more than pragmatic acknowledgement of their potential use in mitigating climate disorder, testing out a radical and affirmative understanding of more than human political realms in which plant metaphors give way to the ecological solidarities and multi-species convergences of post-anthropocentric cosmopolitics. Despite the hostile attitudes to incoming species as a result of their adaptability and self-organizing abilities, they are proving increasingly resilient.
In her long-term project Seeds of Change, Maria Teresa Alves has shed light on the transcontinental histories of ballast flora, examining the journeys of seeds hidden in the soil, sands and rocks, loaded onto empty cargo ships and then unloaded on arrival in port, allowing the dormant seeds to germinate in new lands. This invisible movement of seeds was, as she discovered, in the course of her research, closely linked to the triangular trade in enslaved Africans, since by the mid-18th century, slave traders found it more profitable to sell empty on the trip back from America to Europe, necessitating a full load of ballast to stop their ships capsizing. Alongside charts and archival documentation, our installations have included non-native plants that sprout from seeds germinating in earth taken from local ballast sites in European port cities, including Marseille, Liverpool, Dunkirk, and Bristol, reflecting on the more than human temporalities of plants, which enable seeds to remain dormant for decades or even centuries before germinating. Alves raised the question of when exactly seeds become native and how socio-political histories of place determine the framework for belonging. That the geographical identity of plants is largely a cultural and political construct is further suggested by Chris Thomas's observation in Inheritors of the Earth that the biotic exchanges set in motion by Columbus are reuniting the biological world to form a virtual continent or a new Pangaea, dissolving the distinction between native and non-native plants.
In their performance lecture, The Next Invasive is Native, London-based duo Cooking Sections investigated the hysteria around the spread of Japanese knotweed in the United Kingdom. Taking the form of durational reading session in two voices, the work juxtaposed alarmist media representations of the hidden threat of most invasive, killer, aggressive, horror weed, with scrupulous analysis of the plant complex natural and cultural history and its embeddedness in the economic and urbanistic processes. As lecture reveals, before Japanese knotweed began its imaginary assault on British suburbia, it had been a favored exotic addition to Victorian landscape gardens, having been introduced to the country via an unsolicited donation to the botanical collections of Kew Gardens in 1850. Escaping from the wild gardens favored by English horticulturalists of the era, it established itself in the waste dumps, railway embankments, and graveyards across the land. Since the 1970s, the epicenter of the supposed knotweed invasion has been the post-industrial city of Swansea, where the lead and sulfur polluted soils of the relic factories were conducive for resettlement by plant that originally flourished on the nutrient-poor lava slopes of Japanese volcanoes.
One of the lines in the script proclaims, "Empire redesigned the wild," pointing to the artist's guiding interest into the interference of colonial legacies with the global distribution of foods. This was the primary focus of their overarching venture, the Empire Remains shop, which from a temporary project space on Baker Street in London, considered through a series of performances, installations, and discussions held in 2016, the possibility and implications of selling back the remains of the British Empire in London today. The recent cultural, environmental, and an economic history of knotweed suggests, however, not so much the redesign of empire by the wild, but rather the agency of the new wild in reconfiguring landscapes degraded by colonialism and industrial development. The imagined power of knotweed to smash through concrete and its equally unfathomable ability to devastate house prices was the subject of the devaluing property real estate agency that the artist set up in the storefront of the Empire Remains shop. Passers-by could inspect the toxic assets portfolio in the window display and consult with the artists about the fact that, despite its terrible reputation and effect on property values, Japanese knotweed has many potential benefits for the post-industrial ecosystem.
The repetitive enunciation of the pairing native-non-native led cooking sections to speculate about the threshold necessary for an alien plant to become naturalized. 3 years, 30 years, 300 years, 3,000 years, or 30,000 years. Pointing to the arbitrariness of such criteria for establishing a plant's degree of belonging, they determined that in the long run, most native flora could actually be seen as the alien invaders. This corresponds to the scientific insight that ancestors of all species that are alive today flowed back and forth across the globe for many millions of years. Therefore, we should never assume that where we see a species today is where the creature's ancestors originated. The alternation between native and non-native in cooking sections dialogue occasionally expands to include the identifier invasive, complicating distinctions between the ecological role of species in particular ecosystems. In that sense, it is important to point out, as an additional counter to the habitual demonization of non-natives, that the cumulative impact of industrial pollution and climate chaos is also having unpredictable effects on the behavior of native plants. As anthropologist Anna Tsing has noted, native species can be just as aggressive as the despised interlopers when they abandon companionable habits to carve a path of destruction across the landscape.
The arbitrariness with which resettled species are adopted or rejected by popular political movements to serve their wider campaigns to stoke fears about the contamination of national culture by foreign influences is elucidated in Bensegeorge Palinkash's Hungarian Acacia. Realized collaboratively with Christoph Kellerman, it took the form of a post-fact documentary theatre piece telling the story of an alien species that became Hungary's most patriotic tree. The black locust, or false acacia tree, arrived in Hungary 300 years ago from North America, first taking root in aristocratic gardens and spreading since across the country to the extent that it is now widely considered to be the most Hungarian tree. In 2014, when the European Union discussed placing the tree on a blacklist for the prevention and management of the introduction and spread of invasive alien species, the Hungarian government reacted unexpectedly by leaping to the defense of the black locust, pronouncing the tree to be a Hungaricum, which is an official brand for entities of cultural, culinary, or strategic significance to the Hungarian nation. So the Hungarian Acacia theatre piece dramatized through choral chanting, educational slam poetry, and multimedia projections the entangled natural and human histories of the black locust tree and the manipulation of the species in the political arena, concluding that if the black locust could become a Hungaricum, then anybody who can take root in Hungarian soil can be Hungarian.
The black locust, despite its negative reputation among conservationists who view the tree through the lens of invasion biology, actually shares many of the characteristics that have led supporters of the New Wild to re-evaluate the role of the so-called invasive species in restoring degraded ecosystems. Notably, it was only in the wake of the Second World War that the black locust began to spread more widely in Hungary, finding fruitful ground in ruined post-war landscapes where it invaded the rubble left after bombing of urban sites to gain a foothold as a spontaneous pioneering tree. Forest ecologists have also pointed out that it characteristically dominates early stages of forest regeneration and rapidly colonizes open sites in suburban wastelands, mining areas, abandoned fields and pastures, forest gaps, or sites damaged by fire, preparing the way for other plant species to return and re-establish dynamic biological processes. The autonomous way in which it spreads and the extent to which it's self-regulating and responsive to the changing environment and the revival of other species shows the workings and potential of the self-management of plants in reparation of damaged landscapes and adapting to climate change. As one proponent of the New Wild pointed out, nature desperados have proven colonists and exploiters of the ecological mess humans left behind, making them nature's best chance of healing the damage done by chainsaws and plows, by pollution and climate change.
Polish artist Alicja Rogalska uncovered the contradictions in routinely applied distinctions between the notions of native and non-native as attributed to both plants and people in her Alien Species Jersey Migrant Worker Archive project in 2018. The work referred in its title to the Aliens Restriction Act of 1920, which imposed strict conditions on all foreign nationals living in or visiting the island of Jersey in the English Channel, who were forced to carry alien cards until the 1960s. The work engaged specifically with the current wave of migrant labourers from Eastern Europe who picked Jersey's most important crop, the Royal Jersey potato, the only variety of this transatlantic newcomer to benefit from a European Union protected designation of origin trademark, which presumably it will now lose as a result of Brexit. A complex interplay between the politics of civic and botanical classification was already indicated in an 1835 volume on the rarer plants of Britain, in which the author declared that species originally introduced by human agency that presently exist in a wild state now constitute a part of the British flora with just as much claim as the descendants of Saxons or Normans to have been considered a part of the British nation. A notable vegetal protagonist in the contested histories of colonial exploitation of people, animals, and plants during the process of global transfers of the 16th and 17th centuries that are commonly referred to as the Columbian Exchange, the potato was first used in Europe as animal fodder. The example of the Jersey Royal shows that the transition to the full adoption of the newcomer species in the culture of a new territory indicates a gesture that has not yet been extended to the migrant workers who tend it.
The artist's work with the community of potato pickers also entails setting up a prize for the best migrant workers employer in the agriculture sector on the island of Jersey in collaboration with workers themselves. Following the principles of self-management, the strategy and criteria for the prize were developed through a series of discussions with the workers, exploring their labor condition, experiences, and expectations. During each session, the workers made clay potatoes, relying on their tactile memory built over the months and years of picking the crop. One of the clay models made during the discussions was voted the ideal potato by the workers, cast in bronze and incorporated into the trophy given as the prize to the best employer. The publicity attached to the prize was designed to draw attention to the poor working conditions faced by migrant laborers and was a form of creative self-organization that disrupted the top-down and exploitative model of intense agriculture.
The historical demonization of newcomer species in Cold War science and nationalist ideology, together with the more recent resurgence of manipulated fears of invasive plants in the cynical rhetoric of anti-globalist populism, has been demystified and countered in critical art and science. Encroaching planetary crisis has focused minds on the ecological benefits brought by new arrivals in terms of reversing biodiversity loss and the pioneering work of so-called invasive species in restoring destroyed landscapes. It's now evident that the main drivers of the sixth extinction are climate change and anthropogenic habitat loss, rather than the homogenizing effect of the global intermixing of non-native species. The rewilding of extractivist sites or suburban wastelands by non-native plants is also now valued for the potential contribution of restorative action in a specific locality to lessening or reversing climate disorder by creating natural carbon sinks. Contemporary artistic engagement with vegetal migrants has explored ways of collaborating with the plant pioneers of the New Wild to model transformative ecological solutions. The gravity of such an endeavor springs from the knowledge that, in the absence of swift and radical action on the largest political scale, the planetary course is set to indiscriminately turn human and non-human Earth dwellers into climate refugees, dissolving any residual distinction between native and non-native.
The well-being of plants in a world transformed by human interventions resides in their emancipation from being poisoned with chemicals, uprooted for urban development, meddled with genetically, or displaced from home soils and endangered by climate change. Rekindling appreciation for neglected vegetation that has found its ecological thriving spot in the wreckage of deindustrializing cities, artists have confronted horticultural prejudices against uncultivated and self-managed plants. As global warming endangers the supply chains and social systems of high-tech world of carbon capitalism, the flourishing of ruderal vegetation in harsh, human-altered environments also carries the message about the potential for decentralized and non-coercive models of climate adaptation, also based on the practices of self-management.
So finally, if we were to draw any conclusions, what would self-management mean for art institutions? The system of self-management, which is a form of direct democracy and self-organizing on the principle of social justice, can be seen to operate differently in particular circumstances. The most promising approach lies in the potential histories of socialism in all its non-capitalist diversity. Although the model of Yugoslav workers' self-management never functioned properly since it was always in tension with party politics and was circumscribed by larger political and economic forces and hierarchies, it's arguably a richer source for such models than the state socialism of the Soviet sphere. The Yugoslav histories of self-management, although full of contradictions, also have a more lasting relevance than the drama of the autogestion of May 1968 in Paris, which, although probably a more radical form of self-management, was short-lived and isolated. The insight that socialist self-management, through its very existence and autonomous practices, is corrosive of hierarchical social orders and paves the way for the state to wither away, is an encouragement to small-scale and localized attempts to create alternative ways of living and working together in a restored relation to the natural world.
Socialist self-management, though its decentralized forms, through its decentralized forms and indifference to the relentless accumulation of profit, could also hold clues to the art institutional response to neoliberal constraints. In their adaptation to climate change, however, the optimal approach would be for art institutions to learn from the self-organizing capabilities of plants, especially pioneer plants such as weeds and newcomers.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maja and Reuben, for sharing with us this amazing artworks. Now we have time for questions. So I ask our virtual participants to write their questions in the chat. And here, I guess if you have a question, probably you will have to come here because we don't have a microphone. We have a experimental setup since we had 2 COVID cases in our group and we cannot be inside anymore. But yeah, if anyone wants to comment or ask a question. Maybe I will start, but could you tell us a little bit more about this self-organization of workers in Yugoslavia? How did it look like practically? How they were doing that? Just to know for our future discussions.
So there were different phases in the history of self-management in Yugoslavia. So really in the 50s, or after the split with the Soviet Union and Stalin in 1948, they developed, or they kind of legislated for self-management in factories. So in the beginning, it was mostly in factories in the 50s, and it basically was a way of allowing the workers. The workers were both doing the work and also controlling, having a big say about the running of the factory. So it was really about like the management of factories and operating as workers' councils during that period. And then
deciding on the pay,
and
on
things
holidays,
they decided. Yeah, so I mean, quite important things about
how much investment would go into the factory and how the money would be spent.
I mean,
conditions of work.
I mean, in a way, it's, you know, anyone who writes about it doesn't see it in too idealized a way, because you know, it sounds good in theory, but obviously, you know, anytime they tried to do that, there was, you know, it was still happening within a one-party state, and a lot of things were controlled from outside, and there were also experts who could take certain decisions. But it's still interesting that there was this body, there were these workers' councils, which did have an important say about the conditions of the workers, and it was quite an anti-hierarchical system, we know, which connects to other histories of like workers' councils, you know, in the around the Russian Revolution and in other areas and back in history. So, you know, it's quite an interesting phenomenon that people also look to. So in the 60s, you know, this model of workers' councils in Yugoslavia was also recognized in what was happening in Paris in May 68, in terms of rejection of all kinds of hierarchies, including the guiding role of the French Communist Party and trade unionists. So this kind of spontaneity and kind of also rhizomatic, horizontal forms of political organization were also somehow in dialogue, or looked to this Yugoslav model, which in the 60s still seemed quite promising. It was kind of the golden age of non-alignment and third way Yugoslavia. And also, I mean, within the socialist bloc, also the 60s, as you know, was a time when you know, the possibility, the potential of socialism with a human face, as it was called in Czechoslovakia, still seemed viable. And then in the 70s, just to skip forward, then this kind of system of self-management basically decays, and they rename it something else, about you know, attribution of labor, and it has less and less relevance towards the end of the communist period. So really, it's about this, like the heyday of the 60s, that seems most interesting in terms of models and potential models.
Mm-hmm. But wasn't this featured in this movie by Jay Jordan and Isabelle Fremont, Pets Through Utopia, where they are traveling around Europe? Because I think they visit a factory, no, at the very beginning.
Okay, well, there might be. It's
yeah, I mean, you know, workers' self-management is, you know, wasn't exclusively in Yugoslavia. It's something which comes up in any kind of like factory strike situation where the workers take over the factory and decide to do do without the bosses and make all the decisions themselves.
ZAD itself, where the Jay Jordan and Isabel Fremont are based, is another example of how this self-organizing principles could be set in practice.
I guess that the problem that appears here is that many workers now that contribute to what art institutions are doing are not employees. They are freelancers. So the structure of a work field, I think, is very different now. And as a freelancers, we very often have no contact with other freelancers working for the institution. The question is like, what are some forms that can, I guess, correspond to that structure?
I mean, if you could say that if an arts institution was run on a self-management basis, then they wouldn't give that kind of contracts. They would have the power, the people who are in the institution, to give people proper contracts and not employ them on a precarious basis and give them rights and holiday pay and so on. So it's quite relevant to today's era when there are so many of these rights, labor rights, have been completely demolished, basically, as a result of precarity and 0 hours contracts, especially in the UK as well. So yeah.
So nice to see you.
We wish we were there with you.
I know, it would have been nice to have been in 3D for the first time. But we thank you for sharing such amazing work. It's really wonderful to see that presentation. And many of us have been speaking about the toxicity of cultural institutions that we're either currently working with or have extricated ourselves from to maintain our own sanity and well-being. And I'm just wondering, outside of the art projects that you've been showing that are dealing with self-management, if you have come across models within current art institutions that are kind of looking at this idea of self-management and inspired by the way in which the plants are working, because this is something we've been talking a lot about here. So it was just, or even in your own translocal space, whether, plant thinking is something that's influenced how you're working and the spaces that you choose to collaborate with.
I think that's a really good question on point. So I think, whether there's any kind of concrete examples or not.
There are, again, based on mostly it's, or often it's artist-run spaces, or spaces that are run on more artistic principles rather than managerial kind of neoliberal principles that are run. And there are examples across from Central Europe where the artists or academics together with artists have moved to countryside and starting a new kind of even academic institution in completely natural environment with the farming and living with animals together and working on this topic and theorizing their work at the same time. There's an example of a Czech collective, Woods, just simply called Woods, which have moved to the countryside out of Prague and experimenting with these art forms on kind of more self-managerial level, and they're making summer schools and other ways of creating work and living in accordance more with these egalitarian principles and also with nature. There are examples from Latin America, from all over. The problem is that it's more on the level of 1960s, where we have indications of how it could be done. But the problem is that it's not happening on the more meta level, where it could be taken as a much as something, or as a template that could work in all more or wider and circumstances, and is more applicable to the institution as they function now. So there are examples to learn from, and the question is how to implement it on a wider level. And I think learning from plants is something that is ultimate kind of goal, and not just for the institutions, but actually for the society in general, because I think that where the science is at its most exciting is trying to learn of how to recreate photosynthesis. And that's what plants do without a problem. But artificial photosynthesis would be a solution to post-coal world. and how to use sun energy in a way that you can sustain yourself in the different ways. And it's incredibly has incredible potential. And learning from plants in that way, we're still too far away to learn the intelligence that plants have and ability that plants have in that sense. But also the fact that what we were talking about, this kind of resilience that these hated and neglected plants have actually in the devastated environment. And soon the planet will turn into such a state anywhere, not just in the industrial or post-industrial sites and urban wastelands, but actually everywhere. If something is not done, then really our only hope to survival is to reenact the plant's way of like self-seeding, self-organizing, and resilience that they and adaptability that they have, which we're so far away from achieving.
It's also on the level of metaphor, because there's as a way of talking about an institution, just to choose to use a more plant metaphor, rhizomatic, sort of horizontal way, and thinking about nurturing and care and so on, and knowing how plants really do work and live and share and cooperate underground is a different way. It sort of suggests a different imagery of an institution. Which is not hierarchical, not about a director and different departments. Like if you think of an organizational map of an institution, it suggests a very different form of organizational map, which could, I think, also potentially also be applied to larger institutional structures as well, if there was a will. And I mean, there is a necessity to do that. I mean, it's the current. I mean, as a result of climate change, it's just impossible to carry on as we are. All big institutions seem to be, or I mean, maybe even all institutions seem to be in total crisis about which way to go forward. I mean, you mentioned this, massive heat. I mean, it really is, the next 2 days here, it really, people are starting to warn about, like, the complete collapse of infrastructures. Even healthy people won't be able to deal with it. And
I don't know if you
it
can
seems
hear
to be a bit
us.
frozen. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Simon Stewart. I was wondering if Hannah Arendt's thoughts on citizen assemblies council could be imagined as a framework for self-management. I understand Arendt's councils are thought to be smallest form of council democracy, political, spontaneous, participatory, without any set agenda, exchange of multiple viewpoints, listening, economic.
So we can't hear you at the moment. So could we missed the we can read it. So we I think that they maybe can hear us. Yeah, I mean, you can hear us. Okay, so yes, I mean that's another description of these kind of organizational principles. But maybe what's particular about self-management compared to Hannah Arendt's idea of citizen assemblies, it's very much focused on the workplace and economic and social processes rather than just a kind of a political structure. So in a way, it's not just a model for a type of political representation, or even if it's a very decentralized direct form of democracy, but it's actually a form of direct democracy that works in a specific place, and is embedded in the economy and the economic reality of the working relations. But I think really with climate change, it's no longer possible to sort of separate and say, oh, there's this political sphere where we make decisions, and then there's another sphere of life. It's about how to bring these kind of principles of self-management into the into the very kind of economic and social structures of institutions and society. Although obviously there are Hannah Arendt also is interfering or is contributing to a wider discussion, going back to to ancient Greece, but also Rousseau in the 18th century in terms of thinking about democracy and the limits of representative democracy, and thinking about the potential of direct democracy. But the self-management seems to be something which is has a different kind of resonance today because of its applicability to actual institutions of the economy rather than just political bodies.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Does anyone have a question or a comment here? Okay, then we have a question also in the chat window from one of our participants, a member of Sourgrass Collective, Yao, and she says, thank you so much, Maja and Reuben, for the insights brought forward by these artworks, interventions, and the cunning unearthed by vegetal life. I find the negotiations very instructive as we try to organize ourselves beyond institutions, thinking through issues around belonging, justice, labor, and living. What practice or practices have you incorporated into your everyday living that this intelligence has informed? What have you noticed?
And it says, we can hear you.
Yeah, because, yeah.
That was the answer to the question.
Yeah.
It's a very good question. Yeah. And this is something that we kind of have to constantly ask ourselves, because whenever you think you work something out, the circumstances change and you have to reassess kind of your findings. And but the questions around the understanding, what you learn from understanding about the new wild, which includes the so-called invasive species and the weeds and their role they play in the environment, and how these is being used and abused by the political agendas, especially everywhere, but especially in the neo-populist societies, which unfortunately have best thrived in the post-socialist states and in other similar places, is that you really need to be accepting and tolerant towards the newcomers, and be very aware of such manipulations and abuses. I would say that is something that everyone has to really kind of be aware of and take into practice on everyday level, and also in the functioning, whether in any kind of academic, curatorial, or other working environment. And so this is kind of ecological and social justice, something that is really, really important.
And also if you're organizing a group or some kind of seminar or something, it always seems to be best to try and do this on principles of care and some kind of equality, right? We always try and avoid kind of hierarchical structures in the way that we organize our also academic events and seminars and discussions and so on, and groups that people are able to exchange on an equal level, rather than introducing kind of artificial hierarchies and so on. So that's somehow in our working practice how we maybe try and think about these problems, as we know everybody here does.
Oh, sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
We don't have more questions, so we can finish on time. And thank you so much, Maja and Reuben, for sharing your insights with us. Thank you so much.